Okay, we are now ready to commence. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Devin Carbato, and I'm a professor of law here at the law school. And before I say anything else, I'm hoping that the people who presented at concurrence, if you could please stand up. So anyone who presented at a concurrence, can you please stand up? I wanted to do this because the feature of a concurrence is obviously that we can't all go to all of the concurrence. But I've been hearing about your presentations in the corridors, and I have to say they've broadened the scope and substance of this conference in profound ways. So we really do appreciate your participation. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce the person who really needs no introduction, the person whose work is the basis for our convening, Cheryl Harris. Cheryl Harris is the Rosalind and Arthur Gilbert Foundation Chair in Civil Rights and Civil Liberties here at the School of Law. She is one of the founding faculty members of the Critical Race Studies program and is currently serving as the program's faculty director. She has won numerous awards, including a Distinguished Teaching Award from the ACLU of Southern California. She has a sophisticated and diverse practice background, including serving as a senior legal advisor to the city of Chicago during Harold Washington's administration. She has an enviable publication record, including not one but two publications in the Harvard Law Review. She has engaged in constitutional reform efforts outside of the United States, including her work in the early 90s with South African lawyers vis-a-vis the South African Constitution. And she has maintained an active role in a variety of organizations, including the American Studies Association and the Conference on Black Lawyers. Now, I don't want to mention any of that, which is a little disingenuous since I kind of just did. What I want to do instead is say a few things about the article, Whiteness as Property, as a point of departure to say a few things about the author, Cheryl Harris. Concretely, I want to highlight just three features of whiteness as property that bears emphasis, notwithstanding that we've been talking about whiteness as property for 2 days. So, the three things. Thing one, the title, Whiteness as Property. Say it with me after three, the title, Whiteness as Property. Now, I confess, when I read that title, I instinctively and uncontrollably said, Amen. Now, I literally tried to turn to myself and said, Devin, can I get an amen? Amen? It's the kind of title that has you at the title. Thing two, the introduction. Beautifully, 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 beautifully written. Analytically sharp, theoretically sophisticated, and wonderfully, wonderfully poetic. To read from that introduction is to be existentially moved, not only to a place where racial hierarchy is normative and natural and legal, but to a place where that hierarchy structured and policed the boundaries of identity, the boundaries of rights, the boundaries of work, the boundaries of public and private spaces, the boundaries of intimacy, the boundaries of democracy, indeed, the very boundaries of life and death. I want to read just a little bit from that introduction to put into sharp relief the fact that no second-hand description or redescription of that narrative will do. So imagine I'm reading this in the voice of Cheryl Harris. In the 1930s, some years after my mother's family became part of the great river of black migration that flowed north, my Mississippi-born grandmother was confronted with the harsh matter of economic survival for herself and her two daughters. Having separated from my grandfather, who himself was trapped on the fringes of economic marginality, she took one hard look at her choices and presented herself for employment at a major retail store in Chicago's Central Business District. The decision would have been unremarkable for a white woman in similar circumstances, but for my grandmother, it was an act of both great daring and self-denial. For in doing so, she was presenting herself as a white woman. In the parlance of racist America, she was passing. Her fair skin, straight hair, and aquiline features had not spared her from a life of sharecropping into which she had been born in Anywhere, Nowhere, Mississippi, the outskirts of Yazoo City. She was transgressing boundaries, crossing borders, spinning on margins, traveling between dualities, rigidly bifurcated into light, dark, good, bad, white, black. No longer immediately identifiable as Lula's daughter, she could thus enter the white world, albeit on a false passport, not merely passing, but trespassing. Every day, my grandmother rose from her bed in a house in a black enclave in the south side of Chicago, sent her children off to a black school, boarded a bus full of black passengers, and rode to work. Each evening, my grandmother, tired and worn, retraced her steps home, laid aside her mask, and re-entered herself. She left the job some years later, finding the strain too much to bear. Now that reading, which is a redaction of the actual introduction, I'm sure I performed some violence with that redaction, was not nearly in the kind of spoken word rhetorical form that it really deserves. I simply want to say that no second-hand description really can capture that. You have to read it, stay with it, or better yet, ask Cheryl Harris to read it to you. Thing 3, the mobilization of the master's tools. So this is a point about Cheryl's article that I think has not been fully articulated. She takes on traditional property theorists. In this respect, Jerry Kong was right to say yesterday that the metaphor of whiteness as property in the article Whiteness as Property is deeply powerful, rhetorically, normatively, theoretically, doctrinally. Peggy Radin was also right to say, though, that the things we attribute to property, what we might call its definitional features, are entailments of whiteness. And this is a point that Cheryl Harris makes in the piece and that you all, with me, are going to underscore in the moment. So I'm going to say something like, property theorists say whiteness as property is X, and you are going to say, Cheryl Harris says whiteness is X. There's going to be a call and response moment, in other words, and I'm going to be calling, you're not going to let me call without your response. I'm in it. So here's what I have in mind. So, property embraces things to which a person may attach value. Cheryl Harris says, whiteness embraces things to which a person may attach value. Property law theory says that property includes the right to exclude. Cheryl Harris says, all right. Property is being able to draw on the advantage of a thing possessed. Cheryl Harris says, you're doing well. 2 more. Property is a thing you can use and enjoy. Finally, property includes having entitlements legitimized in law. So I could go on. The point I mean to make here is that she makes a very strong theoretical argument about what whiteness is based on what the man says whiteness is. And it's important to recognize that that's a part of our argument. So let's switch from the article to the woman behind it. I will not, in a limited time that I have, try to capture what a brilliant and broad-ranging scholar Cheryl Harris is, except to say parenthetically that we're talking about her work on whiteness as property, but we could be talking about her other work as well. She's written, I mean, the slide doesn't quite capture it. She's done stuff on legal ideology, intersectionality, employment discrimination, among other areas of law. All I want to say about that body of work is A, it's there, B, it's terrific, and C, you should read it. So what I want to do in the limited time that I have now, if you'll indulge me, is just say a few things about how crucial Cheryl has been to the institutional and intellectual life of the law school since she joined the faculty. It's no accident that the only law school in the country with a joint degree program in law and African American studies is a law school on whose faculty Cheryl Harris sits. It's no accident that the only law school in the country with a critical race studies program is a law faculty on which Cheryl Harris sits. Now, Cheryl Harris helped to conceptualized, and was a driving force behind both institutionalizations. More generally, our institutional citizenship has been exemplary. In terms of committees, you name it, she has served on it. I won't bore you with the list, except to say that recently we decided at the law school that we needed an ad hoc committee on ad hoc committees. I kid you, Laura Gomez is my vice dean. She will attest to this. We said we need, I think we were competing with the university, which has a committee on committees at the universities. At any rate, once we said we needed this ad hoc committee on committees, we also said immediately that we need Cheryl Harris to serve on it. Cheryl, we've had our first meeting? Yes, we did. And better you than me is all I would say. With respect to university services, it's actually the same thing. She's currently serving as the interim chair of African American Studies, and I know that my colleagues in African American Studies are saying, I hope she stays, to which I say, get in bloody line. Wait your turn. With respect to mentoring and teaching, she's absolutely revered by her students. So here are some of the things that students say about her directly from the source, the teaching evaluations. She's inspiring, charismatic, absolutely brilliant. Not that unapproachable, arrogant type of brilliant. An excellent professor, truly a CRT expert. I could not imagine taking this course, CRT, from anyone else, which is to say the rest of us are chump change. Based on my experience at UCLA, I would have to say that Professor Harris is one of the best professors I have ever had. Another student in that same class disagreed, noting that Professor Harris is, quote-unquote, definitely the best professor I have ever had. Another, she is the authority on constitutional law. Another still, this is more than a class. What does that mean? This is more than a class. It's a class! According to another student, she made the information as interesting as it could be, given the fact that we spent a lot of time talking about what old dead white guys had to say 200 years ago. Here's another. I loved this course. Another. I loved this course! Exclamation mark. Another still. I really loved this course. I've never seen so many expressions of love in her teaching evaluations, I have to say. And then there were these adjectives, these one-word adjectives that read as though they were applicable to a blockbuster movie. We might call this movie Whiteness is Property. Let's say this is the poster for it. Cheryl, I'm not quite sure. I'm not sure why it's rated R. Something's still missing, so let's say it's starring Jerry Kahn. So here's what I mean. So you read the teaching evaluations and you see things like fantastic, exciting, phenomenal, brilliant, awesome, terrific. As I read these evaluations, I thought I might see 2 thumbs up, way up. I didn't quite see. 2 more comments and then I will stop. Professor Harris looks unfazed by even some of the most offensive opinions we read. She doesn't even blink when students say things that are, shall we say, a little out of touch. Now, we're very familiar with this. We call it her poker face, and it's absolutely on display in faculty meetings. I won't say anything more. The final comment, have you ever seen Cirque du Soleil? How they move their bodies in all these amazing and unimaginable ways? Professor Harris does this every class with her body. Not with her body, rather, but with her mind. Maybe you do it with your bodies, too. For all these reasons, Cheryl, you are our Person of the Year. I want to presume to speak for all of us when I channel Pharrell and say that we are happy. Clap your hands because we know your work always speaks the truth, because we're happy. Clap your hands because you're grounded in our diasporic roots, because we're happy. Clap your hands, yes we will. Not to bring this event to a close, clap your hands because you'll always be our CRS Rose. Thank you.
So it was suggested that when I was sort of hyperventilating outside about speaking to you all, that maybe I should do an interpretive dance. So I guess here we are. It really risks parody to start with a long list of thank you. It's like a bad award show. But I've been sort of overwhelmed by the love and how fortunate I am to be the beneficiary of this kind of tribute while I'm still in this world. And so I have to say thank you. I have to start with Jasleen for her dedication and her skill for being slightly OCD, which is required for this job. Maybe not so slightly, but you know what I mean. To Rusty, who has been unflappable, even in the face of impossible demands. Many of you have interacted with him. That's how you arrived here. And I just want to thank him. He's been exemplary. Ditto for Sumit Bod, who is here. To all of my colleagues who have provided support, to all the speakers who have given that most precious resource of time, to all the students and the staff who have done such amazing hours of invisible work. Thank you for giving me this honor. Thank you for reading my work, and thank you for doing the work that inspires me. Thank you to my students, current and former, for letting me teach and for letting me learn from you. And thank you to my colleagues, old and new, who are colleagues and so much more, the ones who believe in my intentions, excuse my failings, who listen to my rants, who've been in the trenches, intellectual and political, who fought with me and for me, who have been the architects of my intellectual home, and the members of my extended family. It's kept me sane, or at least reasonably so. To my brother from another mother, Devin. To Kim and to Laura, my sisters-in-law, who have held my hand, particularly over this talk when I confess my fears that I might disappoint you all, the ones who I never want to let down. For managing the contradiction between joy and terror. To Jerry, to Jyoti, to Noah, to Asla, to Hiroshi, to Sharad, thank you. To my mentors and comrades in arms, those present and those gone on, thank you to my family, to my partner Wisteria, who I love and depend on more than I can say, to my son Tebe, cultural worker and student of life, whose growth and insights inspire me. 1,000 kisses. Thank you to my brothers, my niece, my nephews, my sisters, my friends, my whole family network who have let me be distracted and inconsistent in my attention, who've put up with crazy schedules, short tempers, mad dashes, and all the rest. You know the real deal, and I thank you. 20 years ago, I wrote about the interface of juridical, political, and social conceptions of race and property. I was struck by how race and property as conceived in American law shared a common conceptual nucleus of a right to exclude others. This insight emerged out of a particular historical moment in which colorblindness was the ascendant racial logic and the liberalization of markets was the consensus economic strategy. This gave a particular form to debates about enduring racial inequality as well as the traditional liberal vision of property and ownership. Looking back, there were multiple points of departure that led me there, both micro-personal and macro-political, and I'll try to comment on that here. Looking forward, I'll try to suggest something about continuities and discontinuities, about the ways in which changing conceptions of race and property produce new forms and familiar patterns. And I'm going to try to do so in 3 chapters and a coda. First, a personal and political genealogy. Second, on evolutions, what happened with property and what happened with race. And 3, how forms of whiteness as property are operating under post-racialism. And I particularly want to point to a debate regarding race and class that I think is a location where we can really see this emerging. So first chapter, into the legal academy. I had become a lawyer to pursue racial justice, but there were very few want-ads out there that said racial justice advocate wanted. So I went in search of meaningful work in obvious and unobvious places. By 1984, I landed in the Office of Legal Counsel under the first black and first progressive mayor of the city of Chicago, Harold Washington, who was elected in 1983. The democratic machine, which had exercised virtually uncontested control over the political and economic structure of the city, was in shock, but not so much in shock that it did not quickly form a majority voting bloc of 29 of all white and 1 Latinos out of the 50 council seats and voted themselves in control of all the committees of the council. They racially demonized him. They attacked his character. They threw up roadblock after roadblock. They voted down all of his proposals and his nominees. Does this sound familiar? There was legislative gridlock, and Chicago became known as Beirut by the Lake. These legendary fights inspired a comedian, Aaron Freeman, to craft a riff off of Star Wars, Council Wars, with Washington as Luke Skywalker and the opposition as Darth Vader. The city's first black corporation counsel, who was himself a former well-known civil rights attorney, began recruiting a new generations of lawyers to the project of reform, and that's when I showed up at the city's law department. It was a wild ride. But things began to change when Washington's Progressive Coalition brought a successful voting rights suit over the racial gerrymandering of council districts in the prior election. In 1986, under the newly drawn districts, the Progressive Black-led Alliance was able to elect new aldermen, producing a 25-25 split with the mayor voting to break a tie. That ended the council wars, and with the mayor's re-election in February of 1987, there was tremendous hope. Washington famously argued that he had danced on the grave of the Democratic machine and it was dead, dead, dead. But we were unprepared for what happened next. In November of 1987, he died in his office of a massive heart attack. A split erupted over who would succeed him, and with two black aldermen, one from the old guard and the other supported by the Washington Progressive Coalition, competing for the votes of the council to temporarily replace him until a new election could be held. In fact, within this struggle, key sectors of the black political leadership that had been brought to power by a black-led Democratic insurgency sought reconciliation with the mainstream Democratic Party. At an all-night session in the city council, we as lawyers for the city no longer clearly had a client, and thus attempted to argue for adjournment that would allow some Democratic input. But with City Hall surrounded by thousands of protesters from the Washington Coalition, the white-led opposition prevailed. Their candidate was installed as mayor in a hurried ceremony in a parking lot far from the raging crowd. The next election reproduced this split within the black electorate. The upshot was that by the next election, the old political regime in the city, the remnants of the Daley machine, were updated and reinstalled, from Boss Daley the father to Boss Daley the son, from the Democratic machine to the Democratic Leadership Council. This reconciliation ultimately laid critical groundwork for the election of Barack Obama, first as senator and then as president. I could not, of course, foresee all of that then. What I saw was the shrinking ground for progressive work. Moreover, there was a need to connect to the global struggle, and it seemed manifest. As my longtime mentor, Margaret Burnham, and my new one, Asla Bali, have pointed out, there's a deep interconnectedness between the racial logic of subordination, colonialism, and occupation. I have been involved in solidarity work, in particular in connection with South Africa and with Israel-Palestine. And the South African divestment movement was in full force, and my work with progressive lawyers organizations put me in the middle of those debates and protests and into a heady mix of music, poetry, and the art of resistance. Briefs and analysis for my work by day and poetry and journalism by night. I thought perhaps there might be a way to center the intellectual project and bring my various selves together, and particularly so as a door was closing locally, I applied to an LLM program in international human rights law at the London School and got accepted. Just as I was trying to figure out how to pay for tuition and living expenses in London, several of my mentors, including Hayward Burns, one of the legal visionaries of our time, re-engaged me about teaching law, and it was a fortuitous moment to do so. By 1990, critical race theory had emerged as a trenchant intervention that contradicted the standard liberal account that racism was antithetical to the American legal system. Building from the liberatory politics of the 60s and 70s, CRT had exploded that myth, demonstrating the role of law in constituting the racial regime. Gen 1, Matsuda, Lawrence, Crenshaw, Gotanda, Roberts, Thomas, that would be Kendall, not Clarence. Had thrown the opening salvos, interventions that had been foreshadowed in Derek Bell's earlier groundbreaking work and were manifest in a set of contestations in which he was implicated. In 1989, Bell's protest over Harvard Law School's failure to hire women of color had resulted in student unrest and ultimately his departure from the school. This conflict followed the earlier fight over Bell's replacement when he took the post as dean at another school. When Bell had left on that prior occasion, Harvard, applying neutral standards of merit, could not locate a qualified person of color in the country to take his place to teach a course on race, racism, and American law. This became one of the sites of struggle out of which CRT emerged. How could the nearly all-white and male composition of the legal academy be the product of fair and neutral institutional practices? Was there really only one exceptional one? One per generation? Maybe one every other generation? This interrogation produced many slips, dodges, anxieties, denials, evasions, and like the 7 stages of grief, finally in some instances a begrudging acceptance that the contradiction between inclusion and fairness and the de facto segregation of the academy could not just be managed rhetorically. Like many of my cohort, I entered the legal academy as a beneficiary of that challenge. So in 1990, I started as the first tenure-track person of color on the faculty at Chicago-Kent College of Law. I was not just the new kid on the block. I was what John Calmore called an integration warrior. Definitely on Front Street. You all have been there. As a new professor, I felt compelled to read the entire opinion in all the cases that I assigned. It was an eye-opening introduction to the politics of case selection and editing in constructing the legal canon. Among the cases I read was Plessy, which appeared fleetingly in textbooks as the precursor to Brown. Decided in 1896, Plessy upheld Louisiana's recently enacted law that segregated public transportation and held that it was consistent with equal protection because it treated blacks and whites equally in its prohibition. As Harlan Dissents pointed out, segregation did nothing of the sort. Separate but equal was a fiction. The racial boundaries structured into the train car installed a racial caste system, one that the court ratified. Harlan's invocation of colorblindness rejected that form of racial formalism, but assumed that because white superiority was a given, the crude demarcations of the Separate Car Act were unnecessary. The casebook ended the story with Brown, which overturned Plessy 60 years later. This presumptively cured the injury that Plessy inflicted, a racial progress narrative of redemption and self-correction. What I discovered upon reading Plessy unedited was that the equal protection question, whether segregation violated the Constitution, was not the only issue. The case described Plessy as 7/8 white and 1/8 black, with the admixture of black blood not being discernible in him. Plessy's phenotype, the fact that he looked white, allowed his lawyers to argue that the conductor's decision to exclude him from the first-class so-called ladies' car because he was not white deprived him of the reputation of being regarded as white, and this reputational interest was a valuable property that could not be taken without due process, a standard that was violated by the conductor's standardless determination. It's very difficult to actually find a picture of Homer Plessy. What I'm giving you here is a picture of Rudolph Desnes, who was the head of the Citizens Committee that was involved in that lawsuit. It's also important to note that the racial boundary on the train car was actually structured through a gendered line. That is, the earliest challenges to the law were brought by black women who pointed out the logical inconsistency that as black women they were barred from the ladies' car, while if they were accompanying a white child as a nurse they were permitted to stay. Ida B. Wells was one of those women. Her account of her refusal to leave is legendary. She says, "I refused, saying that I was in the ladies' car. I proposed to stay. The conductor tried to drag me out of my seat, but the moment he caught hold of my arm, I fastened my teeth in the back of his hand. I braced my feet against the seat in front and was holding the back, and as he had already been bitten badly, he didn't try it again by himself. He went forward and got the baggageman and another man, and of course they succeeded in dragging me out." She won her case in the lower court, but it was reversed on appeal. I say that to say that all of the early litigation on this was actually brought by black women. Plessy's property argument did not win, of course. Whether whiteness was marked by a preponderance of white blood, as in Ohio, or less liberally excluding from whiteness those who had more than 1/8 black blood, or any drop of black blood, as in Mississippi where my grandmother was born, the inherent asymmetry under which black blood rendered one black, but white blood did not render one white, revealed that exclusivity and domination were tied. Plessy's argument challenged the notion that the rules of racial assignment were natural, pre-political, and neutral. This was not a rule of biology, but a rule of power. And under it, blackness not only marked enslavement, but the bodies that are enslavable and available for subordination. Rereading Plessy allowed me to uncover the central role of law in constructing racial identity and legitimating white racial dominance through the materiality of property. This was accomplished through slavery's appropriation of labor and property, segregation and its aftermath, the prerequisite cases and naturalization in which whiteness was tethered to citizenship, and through settler colonialism in which the occupation and seizure of indigenous land laid the foundation for the white nation. Rights and property, things, money, land, and ultimately human beings, were contingent on and intertwined with the conception of race. As Du Bois described in Black Reconstruction, even when white privilege did not yield direct economic benefits for the white working class in the form of money, the wages of whiteness were still available as, quote, a public and psychological wage. In this way, whiteness was propertized, to borrow from Peggy. I argue that despite Brown and the legal and policy interventions that sought to disrupt patterns of racial subordination, the valorization of whiteness as a form of property continued in the modern era, and in this sense, the property interest in whiteness that Plessy invoked was doctrinally preserved. This was manifest in the way in which white privilege functions as the background assumption regarding the baseline in disputes over anti-discrimination remedies. As Noah Zatz so lucidly demonstrated the other night, I could have chosen any standard Title VII disparate treatment case to illustrate this problem of the baseline, but I chose the Court's affirmative action jurisprudence to show the problematic logic in treating as equivalent the segregative practices and their consequences and the remedial interventions designed to disrupt them. This reifies white racial privilege as a legitimate and neutral baseline that is protected in law, and to the extent that affirmative action exposed this hierarchy and carried with it a redistributive potential, it was in the crosshairs. In thinking about the multiple ways in which whiteness functioned, my grandmother's story came to me as illuminating something important about white supremacy and the role of law in its entrenchment. Alma's story of boundary crossing, exclusion, subversion, racial trespassing revealed the way in which whiteness was related to property. Alma's narrative was not about mixed race identity, nor was it about ambivalent phenotype. While descent was relevant, it was really the lived experience of racial subordination that bound her to blackness. Some agency was available to her. Choices denied her brown-skinned family, but it remained a relative privilege within a regime that valorized whiteness. The point was that to her, the choice came at a cost, the cost of complicity, of silence, of denial of the reality of her own life and community to which she was inevitably connected. She had become, as I said, a sentinel at planning sessions of her own destruction. That cost, which became unsustainable for her, was what I tried to name in the piece. It has been interesting, if not puzzling, to see the reading of that narrative as a meditation on liminality, of not belonging, of being not really black, or between black and white. Such readings privilege the epistemological question of individual subjectivity, one that has its place, but I was preoccupied with the situatedness, the sedimented and material dimensions of racial subordination to which that subject is tied. And while policing the permissible boundaries of identity has often been a form of oppression, this was not her story, nor my mission. Alma's story was a window into how whiteness was constituted and functioned. Chapter 2, Evolutions, Property and Race. 20 years hence, massive changes at the level of culture, politics, and law and the economy have reshaped the world in unimaginable ways. On the one hand, racial inequality has proven to be quite entrenched, even as domestically and globally, people regarded as non-white increasingly occupy positions of power. Various racial subjects have been called to the scene: white, black, Asian, Latino, biracial, all racial, Calablasian, and otherwise. Nevertheless, I argue that whiteness endures, but has mutated in relationship to evolution in the dominant racial framework and the emergence of post-racialism. Drawing on Sumi Cho's work on this topic, the claim that with respect to racism, it's now mission accomplished, I suggest that post-racialism is a racial ideology that extends the logic of colorblindness and rhetorically moves towards closure while managing new contradictions and conditions. These include various crises, economic and symbolic, regarding race, property, and power. And what happened is part of what I'll try to sketch out here. The 2 points that I want to turn to, there's a lot that's happened with respect to property, but there's 2 points that I want to turn to. One is the assault on the welfare state through the language of property. And second concerns the global crisis of 2008. Both of these are relevant to the contested terrain of post-racialism. So first, the dismantling of the welfare state has been facilitated, I argue, through the rhetoric of property, and that take you back to the 1964 seminal article by Charles Wright called The New Property, which argued that property was so crucial to liberty that even those who depended on government benefits should have certain rights of property in those benefits as a mean of protecting their autonomy. Efforts to translate this insight into due process protections, that is, notice and an opportunity to be heard, for poor people's efforts to secure direct social support, such as welfare or Social Security benefits, really yielded mixed results. That is, over time, even the modest procedural reforms gradually eroded doctrinally. The new property not only proved insufficient to protect the poor from and the most vulnerable from abuse, the process guarantees were inadequate in the face of a highly organized campaign to liquidate the benefits themselves. In other words, the process protections could really not protect against the other move, which was actually to take the benefits out altogether. Ironically, the concept of the new property was itself appropriated by conservatives to authorize the further assault on the welfare state. By 2000, some conservative scholars contended that Reich's concept of new property did not, quote, include the important property right to manage that property interest, and therefore that the privatization of benefits would actually give individuals greater power vis-a-vis the government. Thus, for example, by creating, quote, the new property, through creating private health insurance accounts, for example, rather than publicly funded health care, the poor would have greater autonomy and control. What's important is that while these proposals were advanced by the right, significant segments of self-identified liberals largely co-signed this view. Major figures in the Democratic Party, Clinton and Gore, for example, the Democratic Leadership Council, supported the investment of Social Security funds in the stock market. Robert Reich, the Treasury Secretary, was cited as supporting school vouchers. Everybody signed on for free trade, bank, and financial market deregulation. And this was all sold as a means of individual empowerment, the new property. It legitimated the dismantling of the social safety net, even as corporate welfare accelerated. Indeed, privatization redistributed the public fisc to the private sector. This shift was related to how capital in its corporate form was increasingly shedding its national identity, becoming a faithless and constantly running away person, and simultaneously asserted its rights as a national citizen, white. The implications of this agenda for racial politics and discourse were profound and conflicted. By 1993 and the end of Bush 1 and the beginning of Clinton, the distinction between liberal and conservative racial politics in the major parties had decidedly blurred. Clinton's election was the product of a new Democratic consensus that sought to distance itself from a racial justice agenda on the premise that it was politically untenable and ultimately unnecessary. Pursuant to this logic, there was no benign neglect. Instead, there was a direct infliction of racial injury. This includes sentencing enhancements, the Effective Death Penalty Act, immigration enforcement, and the evisceration of welfare, all in the name of reform. Anemic support for affirmative action came in the form of mend it, don't end it. Any ambiguities, however, about the direction of these trends were settled by the failure to defend Lonnie Guinier's appointment to the Department of Justice in the face of right-wing attacks calling her a quota queen, a label that invoked the racial stereotypes that underwrote the premises of welfare reform to begin with. Simultaneously, however, the party heavily relied upon blacks as the core Democratic voting bloc. So you have this contradiction of an assault and a constant sort of reliance on black political power. Deepening wealth inequality and the erosion of the white middle class was a breeding ground for racial resentment and scapegoating, which both parties mined to secure the support of white voters. Racial inequality was reframed as a subset of general income inequality or as the regrettable but inevitable consequence of cultural difference. Colorblindness, a racial framework that has historically been available to both racist and anti-racist projects, was installed. I want to turn now to the economic crisis of 2008, which I've called the threat to white status property. In 2008, the near collapse of the market triggered fears about the implosion of the economy, and here the presumption was that the market was the economy, and the market was infected with toxic assets. But the property was not polluted by aliens or set upon by external forces. This toxicity had been produced by the very institutions that were now fatally infected. The major banks had created assets that had no value, and through the miracle of securitization, the things that had no value were given a price, sold and traded, were posted as collateral and borrowed against, listed on balance sheets and cited as evidence of growth, and spread throughout the system. This was all enabled by regulatory collapse, or perhaps more accurately, by the dismantlement of the regulatory system, and we are now told that we were this close to an economic Armageddon. Had a government not intervened and bailed out the banks, the entire system would have collapsed. We would have had massive unemployment and frozen credit. Don't we have that now? I'm sorry. The solution was to authorize a massive transfer of public assets into private corporations in the name of saving the capitalist system. We could dwell on the irony forever without ever exhausting its depths. The crony capitalists who screamed about deficit spending were now demanding billions for bailouts, and this crisis created an imperative to open the spigot at the national treasury. But of course this wasn't true for everyone, because not all crises are created equal. I'm thinking in particular of this one. This huge wealth transfer of property held by the state, transfer of property held by the state to private hands was not different in kind, but in scale from earlier moments. In the Wall Street Journal, 3 months after Katrina, neocon idol Milton Friedman salivated, quote, "Most New Orleans schools are in ruins, as are the homes of the children who have attended them. The children are now scattered all over the country. This is a tragedy. It is also an opportunity." As Naomi Klein's Disaster Capitalism explained, Friedman was simply applying an economic doctrine that he has developed and argued for years before. Crises allows institutions to achieve under the state of emergency what would otherwise be politically impossible. Thus, as in the wake of Katrina, where the model for disaster relief, saving the public, involved privatizing the recovery, the neoliberal consensus is that disaster is another word for opportunity. But the financial crisis did not look or feel like an opportunity to many. It felt like a crisis. The crisis of confidence also extended to the system itself, producing an opening for a critique of the particular form of crony capitalism that had been enabled by the dismantling of the already weak regulatory regime. The crisis, however, revealed something more fundamental than regulatory problems. And here I turn to Manfred Max Neff, a renowned Chilean economist and author of the classic Lessons in Barefoot Economics. I really highly commend it to you, who was interviewed about why economists had not foreseen the impending implosion. Max Neff contends that while there has been a massive accumulation of knowledge, there is little or no understanding of the economy, because you can only understand that which you become a part of. Traditional economists are not part of the world, he says, or put another way, they don't see themselves as part of it. They see themselves as separate from it. Because economists do not understand economics to be a subsystem of the broader biosphere, indeed they think the reverse, that nature is a subsystem of the economy, they accumulate ever-increasing quantities of data, but they understand very little. They measure growth and ignore development. Growth is quantitative accumulation. Development is the liberation of creative energy. Growth, classically measured in GDP, the total output of goods and services adjusted for inflation, may reflect increases in the quantity or values of goods and services, but these do not necessarily lead to qualitative improvements in life, the measure of development in things like literacy, life expectancy, environmental quality, and access to health care. While growth has been fetishized, it is finite, while development is not. As adults, for example, we may have finished growing, but we have not completed our development. Max Neff also identified a conundrum about growth. Growth brings about improvement in living conditions, but only up to a point. After that, growth produces a decline in the quality of life. This may seem a paradox, but his diagnosis is that this condition, being neither underdeveloped nor developed, but underdeveloping, now describes the United States. That is, growth presents this paradox. The 1% is improving, but everything else is in stagnation or decline. It is now no longer possible to ensure that the next generation will have better living conditions than the current one. This state of being, of underdeveloping, is part of what is at the root of the anxieties, eruptions, and paralysis that we are both embroiled in and witness to. This has implications for the racial order and underwrites racial panics. Underdeveloped, of course, signifies the third world, the colored, some place that is economically backward, a place where it's best to be from rather than to just be. And as the United States is becoming less and less white, the specter of becoming that underdeveloped colored place looms. The U.S. is in danger of maintaining its status as a white nation and of its property interest in whiteness. So what has happened to race? So partly here I talk about how colorblindness itself has been confronted with certain contradictions and pressures. One of them relates to the idea that discrimination only occurs at the moment of conscious choice. This turns out to be completely false, and the social psychologists and cognitive psych people have invited us to put on the 3D glasses so that we can see the other dimension beyond intent. Color blindness, as it turns out, is not cognitively possible. Babies under the age of 1 are able to make racial distinctions and to make associations based on them. Obasogi has shown that even people who are blind since birth perceive race. An implicit bias, how we unconsciously react differently to different races in different contexts, is endemic. While critics challenge these findings as non-scientific, they cannot stop the growing consensus that maybe we cannot disappear race by simply covering our eyes. The disjuncture between the science and the doctrine that Kang and others have documented creates a compelling argument for doctrinal reform that colorblindness is ill-equipped to answer. Theoretically, colorblindness has also had its discontents. As it turns out, it's impossible to implement or operationalize. Neil taught us that long ago. You cannot ignore that which you've already seen. In fact, colorblindness turns out to be like the instruction to the jury to disregard that last remark. Don't think about the temperature outside. What are you thinking about? Okay. So legislating colorblindness actually intensifies the salience of race. Colorblindness per se also may have decreasing utility in protecting white dominance under conditions of changing demography. Where white status has been a function of power and demography, the shift to a numerical minority triggers particular anxieties, and it threatens whiteness as property. Protecting it may then call for some different or at least updated logics. And here's where I turn to some of Sumi's work and try to think through some of the implications for post-racialism. Mindful of Kim's point, though, that with Ferguson, we may have exhausted the utility of post-racialism. What I want to say is, though, is that the perceived lack of a viable alternative, we may be at a state where we have a necessary but insufficient condition for a radical break with that framework. So I still think it's important to look at it and to be grateful for those contradictions. So under anti-discrimination law, under post-racialism, whites are not simply included as a potential victim. That is, it's not whites, blacks, everybody can be discriminated against on the basis of race. Whites are now the paradigm victim. Secondly, strict scrutiny has effectively extended not only to anti-discrimination remedies like affirmative action, which are now claimed to be a source of injury to whites, but to the entire corpus of anti-discrimination law. And what I mean by that is that voting rights law, school desegregation law, disparate impact law, these are all being subjected to a form of kind of strict scrutiny review. I guess I would say ideologically, post-racialism privileges self-designation. You are what you say you are. And post-racialism conceptualizes racial identity as private property on which the state cannot infringe. And we talked a little bit earlier about Prop 54 in the prior panel, the Racial Privacy Act, another gift from Ward Connerly, which barred the state from keeping information about a person's race. It failed as an initiative in California, but the idea has really taken hold in terms of public opinion. At the same time, this notion that, your sort of racial identity is your business, it's private, you have this kind of racial subjectivity continually being shaped by state power. So blackness is being produced by incarceration and criminalization. The social welfare system is the means through which black and brown women are produced as dysfunctional and deviant subjects. Latino identity is produced by the criminalization of immigration and the construction of the illegal. Muslims as a racialized category are produced by the operation of the national security state. So post-racialism valorizes personal choice, honors agency, be all you can be. However, simultaneously, it reproduces racial logics that support subordination. Secondly, post-racialism's commitment to protect some value in whiteness, however relative, what Derek Bell called the promise not to be the face at the bottom of the well, it coexists with expanding whiteness to encompass non-whites. And I think Chuck was alluding to this a little bit yesterday. Post-racial whiteness is conditionally available to persons of any racial group, even some blacks. Obama's election is really the prize currency in this symbolic racial economy. This is not to say that Obama either sought to be or sees himself as an honorary white person. Certainly the vitriolic racist attacks on his decisions, his competency, his family, his citizenship, all reflect how highly contested his status is. No other president has faced this kind of assault. Rather, my point is that his presidency has been ideologically positioned to liquidate claims of racial subordination and to demonstrate that whiteness is a democratically available social good. Blackness under this regime is fetishized as a symbol of the declining significance of race. However, at the same time, it also embodies threat, anger, danger that can be shot on sight to preserve the national security. What can brown or black do for you? Post-racialism constructs a narrative of inclusion even as actual practices constitute conditions that could provide the Bill of Particulars on a charge of genocide, as did the Civil Rights Congress in 1951. Thirdly, as a racial corollary, post-racial whiteness harnesses the increased incidence of interracial intimate and family relations among whites and non-whites as evidence of the erosion of racial categories and hence of racism. The disappearance of the old categories is accompanied by the appearance of a new one, what Wisteria calls the new race, that is appropriated into the narrative of post-racial transcendence. Fourthly, relatedly, post-racial whiteness reproduces and updates the racial rules. Well, what are the racial rules? Well, Lewis Gordon describes them as follows. Rule 1, be white. Rule 2, if you can't be white, don't be black. Okay. So, given the shifting demographics, one might ask whether this racial logic has fundamentally changed in the post-racial era. Historically, the law rigorously policed the boundaries of whiteness, but courts also expanded whiteness to include groups and persons based on their assimilative traits or performance and in consideration of other social interests. With respect to the latter, for example, Mexican Americans, as Laura has taught us, were formally categorized as whites as part of a project of conquest and empire. I mean, whiteness wasn't extended to Mexican Americans to actually make it better, right? Now, the formal legal adjudication of individual racial identity, that is determining who belongs in what category, is viewed now as a fool's errand. However, racial identity continues to be asserted, ascribed, called for, called upon through a host of legal rules and policies, and underneath this claim of fluidity and infinite gradations and hybridity, whiteness persists. It expands to absorb those who can conform, and importantly, the measure of that conformity often remains the distance from blackness. Perhaps the rule is be white-ish, but still, if you can't, don't be black. Or maybe the rule is be white, but if you can't be white, don't be black, be blackish. I'm not sure, but you get the idea. Okay. Chapter 3, The World is Dialectical. That's from my friend and poet, Sterling Plump. Under post-racialism, the erasure of race and the suppression of race-sensitive remediation has become identified as a liberal project. Many self-declared liberals and progressives have abandoned a race and class analysis for a class, not race analysis, declaring a consensus that race-conscious policy interventions are politically unpopular and practically ineffective and normatively problematic on top of that. Most prominent among affirmative action's alleged deficiencies is that it undermines efforts to address class or quote-unquote real inequality. According to a number of self-identified liberals and even progressives, in failing to deliver for the truly disadvantaged, affirmative action purportedly provides assistance to those who need it least. There are many iterations of this, but Walter Ben Michaels, for example, charges that race-conscious affirmative action simply reproduces elites doing little more than offering a rainbow version of class inequality. Richard Sander has defended his claim that race-conscious affirmative action policies produce academic mismatch, that is, producing unqualified black students in academic environments where they are more likely to fail. He has defended it against charges that it is empirically unsound, and it is, indeed tragically so, and that it trades on tropes of black intellectual inferiority by contending that defenders of race-conscious affirmative action are ignoring class hierarchy in higher education. In Place Not Race, Georgetown law professor Cheryl Cashin has explicitly claimed that her arguments against race-conscious affirmative action and for place ought not to be confused with class-based alternatives, but in many respects her arguments are expressed in a similar against race register. Quote, she says, the civil rights community expends energy on a policy that primarily benefits the most advantaged children of color while contributing to a divisive politics that makes it difficult to create quality K-12 education for all children. And again, the mantra of diversity might be applied to a school that admits African elites or their American cousins like Sasha or Malia or Blue Ivy or my kids, but diversity by phenotype puts no pressure on institutions to dismantle underlying systems of exclusion that propagate inequality. Sasha and Malia, by the way, have their father to thank for making them the poster children for blacks who do not deserve but who are most likely to benefit from race-conscious affirmative action. In an off-cited interview, he said he didn't think they should benefit from affirmative action given their advantages. I think, however, this is just a parenthetical, what would be more instructive to the debate would be to focus not on the children, but on their parents' trajectory, or more specifically, at least Michelle's, as her history is more representative of the often fragile position of the black working class. Given that the early demands for race-conscious affirmative action were structured around race and class, how did things move to class, not race? Even if prior campaigns failed to implement a true class and race agenda, why is the cure for that failure to jettison race? Rather than mobilizing a sense of linked fate, that dismantling racial hierarchy is joined with addressing the problem of capitalism, these projects are placed in opposition, and the challenge to white entitlement or white privilege is then recast as an elitist, anti-populist project. The class not race argument ignores the accumulation of advantage and disadvantage that is embodied in the materiality of race. Whiteness is not a skin color or even a racial type. It is a social relation constructed on exclusion, structural privilege, and its valorization. When critics of race-conscious remediation adopt the framework of class not race, they are in danger of conceptualizing race as something outside of the social, political, and ideological domain. Joel Olson's The Abolition of White Democracy makes a similar critique of political theory. While most see a tension between democratic egalitarian ideals and racism, Olson argues that race is not created, quote, prior to or outside the political realm. Rather, it is produced within it and is therefore a product of democracy rather than its antithesis. Thus, the restriction of citizenship, this is an example he uses, to white free persons was not only that white persons could become citizens, it is that becoming a citizen effectively made one white. Class not race adherents labor under similar misconceptions in arguing that a precondition of addressing class inequality is erasing race. This conceives of race as an ascriptive characteristic, almost a free-floating signifier, and ignores the ways in which race has produced class, the infamous notorious idea of things being mutually constitutive. To talk about class is to invoke a category that is always already racially marked. If somebody describes a neighborhood bar as working class, what would be your guess as to its racial demographic? What if I described it as upper class? Now, true, we're all sophisticated enough to know that these phrases do not necessarily mark the bar or the neighborhood as white, but a common inference would be that it is. And it's David Roediger's The Wages of Whiteness, which is a brilliant riff on Du Bois, explains why working class is a racially coded social category. The very construction of a working laboring class was crafted by differentiating it from slavery. Centuries later, whiteness confers relative advantage across the board, for whites at every income level have significantly more wealth than blacks at comparable levels. Ditto for Latinos. Whites also have better health outcomes, live in better neighborhoods, even if they are poor. The poor whites do not attend segregated high-poverty schools. Most importantly, whites are ensured that their political interests are never at the margins of the political discourse, even if the system fails to deliver on its promises. And this is how whiteness comes to function as a cross-class coalition. This is not to suggest that this is always a peaceful relationship. At one level, the current crisis has tested that arrangement. Anxiety over the future of whiteness because of shifting demographic patterns and the deeply destabilizing character of the 2008 crisis has given birth to two oppositional movements, one explicitly reactionary and color conscious, the Tea Party, and the other explicitly progressive and largely colorblind, Occupy. There are several implications that flow from this in terms of deconstructing the class, not race analysis. While the great bugbear of social science research, the thing you're never supposed to do, is to conflate correlations with causation, something that is replete in Rick Sanders' work, for example, the problem with the class, not race arguments, particularly its liberal and progressive versions, is to treat the relationship between class and race, specifically between whiteness and relative advantage and blackness and relative disadvantage, as correlational when in fact it is causal. The fact that blacks are clustered at the lower end of the distribution of wealth and income is not coincidental. It reflects the continuation into the present of a set of practices and social relations that secured for whiteness relative value and class privilege. Class in this country has meaning beyond income or wealth. It is actually a material expression of racial hierarchy. Whiteness confers relative benefits on all whites, even those burdened by class oppression. Class, not race, denies this fundamental fact, and in doing so, functions as a discursive strategy under which whiteness is protected. And now to the coda on resilience. get up off the pavement, brush the dirt up off my psyche. That's Earl. Recently, the news reported that a white lesbian couple has sued the sperm bank that provided them the sperm used to conceive their baby because the company mistakenly sent the sperm from a black donor. They are suing for wrongful birth and breach of warranty, citing the damages arising from the difficulty of trying to raise their now 2-year-old blackish, mixed race daughter in an all-white community. Their sexuality has made it difficult to gain acceptance from their family and the small town in Ohio where they live. The addition of a black child has made it even worse. They also don't know what to do with her hair. I'm not lying, that's in the lawsuit. They have to take her to a black neighborhood to deal with it. This is hard. This is hard, people. Maybe the case won't survive, maybe it'll get tossed, but I just want to ask, what kind of world is this? Where the birth of a colored child is grounds for a claim for money damages. 50 years ago, in Doe versus Louisiana, a black mixed-race child born to a white mother was at the center of a dispute over her racial classification and adoption. And I want to thank my student, I don't know if Shai is here. Sharissa here? Okay. For helping me connect this. This is what I mean when I say we learn from our students. She was born to a white mother, and the mother died, and the child, who was classified as white on her birth certificate, was given to her aunt, her mother's sister. But because the child looked black, this arrangement was increasingly untenable. A black man who had been involved with the mother sought to adopt the child, but the court refused to reclassify her as black, leaving her in the hands of her wary and weary white aunt. There are surely profound differences between then and now, but the echoes of that case, the persistence of notions of whiteness as property, are with us in the here and now, and we are called upon then to remain attentive, connected, committed, and resilient, because there are many, many children that need us to be so. Thank you.
So Cheryl is happy to entertain any and all questions, so please feel free to raise them. The mics are there, so queue up so that people in the overflow room will be able to hear. So any questions, comments?
Okay, I have two. The first one is, so where will this be published? Okay, that's very, very important. This has to be published. In fact, you should just do a book with the reproduction of the original and this. I'm telling you.
Thank you,
The second
Robin.
question has to do with in part two of your talk. Is something you know, and I want you to elaborate on, is that part of the blame of the economic crisis of 2008, of course, fell on black and brown
Right.
Mortgage owners,
Right.
which really makes the connection between property and what happens when black and brown people get property in terms of real estate, and that being the source of the
cause.
collapse.
Right.
So I just want you to sort of riff on that a little bit.
It's a really brilliant point, and I've thought a lot about how this crisis around creating this fictive property, this toxic property, rested upon the exploitation of black and brown people and their relationship to property. So there really is a deep relationship, Robin, and I really want to explore it. I think there's already been some people that have been doing some work. I saw a piece in the New York Times some time ago about the securitization and trying to actually trace the path There are actually neighborhoods that you can go to and find out. I mean, it takes like a detective work because it's so layered. But there are neighborhoods that you can actually identify that were targeted for these kinds of toxic loans, that people knew that they were exploiting these homeowners. And the thing about it is, of course, this is not the first time. This is the second or third cycle of this, right? And one of the questions I think that we have to sort of ask is, what are the changing relationships of capital to both the intangible and tangible property, and what are their implications for the racial politics on the ground? And that's what I think, but thank you for that. That's a very helpful question. We can also just go.
What I've learned over the past 2 days is that sometimes it takes a while for people to warm up, so I just want to make sure that
Okay.
There's no one there with a desire to ask a question.
Okay.
I'll swallow my cookie first. I was wondering if you could, just from your perspective, sort of give an overview of the last 20 years of the kind of criticism.
Already an overview.
Yeah. The critique, the negative response. I mean, we've been celebrating your work for the last few days, and, and how that has evolved over the decades. And
What are some of the critiques?
And yeah, and from your perspective, because that will help inform how the piece will, we can make it work continually in the future.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the critiques is it's theory. What's it got to do with anything? How do you use it in a lawsuit? Right. One of the other critiques is, I think I was alluding to it a bit, and I'm not sure if this is a critique. Maybe I'll just say that it's a deployment of the work that and I want to say this, one of the things is that this has been such a tremendous gift because I get to see what comes back, and what comes back is so rich. And so I don't want to sound as though I'm picking, but I guess I would say that there's been a particular strand of reaction to the work which is centered on questions of whether or not my grandmother was really black. Whether or not it really is useful to sort of think about it in this way because there's a kind of core claiming of identity in the piece that's kind of old school, I guess, or something. And I think that it's entirely legitimate for people to pursue their own intellectual projects about subjectivity and racial identity and all the rest of that's totally fine. It's just that what I was trying to say is that was not what Alma was telling me, and I was trying to tell what Alma was telling me. So different people can experience it in different ways, but that would be, I guess, one thing. And then I guess I would just offer, if there's anybody else that can think, you all have showered me with so much, affirmation. I can't think of a single negative thing right now.
Chuck?
I just want to not think of another negative thing, but say that you have been too kind, I think, to these people who've used your work in this way by saying everyone has their own intellectual project. But I think one of the things I was trying to say yesterday is this is a choice that joins the very narrative that you have confronted and uncovered. To use your work in this way is in fact to join the narrative that uses post-racialism to act as if there is no property in whiteness, and that move does that. So it's not just it's a misuse of your work which has political consequences, and people ought to be held to account for it.
Yes, sir. Hi. Is this a question? Okay. I didn't want to be that situation where somebody's got to leave the room.
Never in the middle of one of your talks. Hi, Professor Harris.
Hi, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Good.
We can continue that conversation later. I've been thinking a lot in light of the lawsuit that the Ohio women filed over the birth of their blackish or not white child, and the relationship between the discussion of the deprivation of whiteness as the deprivation of due property because it's whiteness is a property interest. But now we are sort of in this paradigm of being saddled with the debt or the liability of a negative situation, a race that you don't want. And I'm wondering what the legal prism will become for understanding that phenomenon, because I'm sure that cases like this will continue to come up.
Yeah, I'll be interested to see what the courts do with this one. And I guess what I was trying to suggest is that, in a way, the doctrinal moves are one level to interrogate, which I think are important. But what I think of is, what is the cultural context under which even this claim is even cognizable? Right? What are the set of assumptions under which you can even fashion this as a cognizable claim for a breach? Right? And so it's that level at which the racial ideology is functioning that makes that a claim that you can read and understand, right? And the specificity with which it's making certain claims about the burdens are really, it's almost like you remember that Peggy McIntosh piece about specifying the benefits of whiteness? It's almost like that complaint is another iteration of that. And so I'm very interested. Don't get me wrong, I'll be fascinated to see. I'm trying to imagine the judge's response. But I really was also trying to hearken to the question of what is it that even makes that claim cognizable? Not even legally cognizable. I'm just talking about that we can read it and understand what it's saying. Okay.
I had a question, Cheryl, I wanted to ask. What strikes me about your piece from standpoint of Black Studies, it's its fundamental interdisciplinarity and the way in which you put together things that are often not thought of in the same space within the academy. It's almost, as if the law is in the whiteness space, right? And then, the history of slavery is in a space actually often outside of the teaching even of American history.
Yeah.
And then the way in which you have personal memory. And so I just was wondering if you could share with us what sort of reading how was your reading going about that you were reading these different things and then how it kind of came together, because it seems almost magical to me.
That is such a wonderful question because now I get to give some credit. So when I started, I call myself a 1.5er generation. Because by the time I came to the Academy in 1990, there was already a growing body of work. So I was reading Matsuda and Lawrence and Crenshaw, and one of the things that I don't know if I've ever said to you, Mari, but her footnotes are genius, and they are an absolute interdisciplinary lesson in how to weave in everything. And for me, that was really key because I think I went back to the beginning and talked about, I was writing poetry and journalism at night and briefs during the day, and I'm starting to feel a little schizoid. So one of the things that I think in response to your question is to say that I was modeling myself on some things that I was seeing, which is that the disciplinary boundaries are themselves, that's why they're called disciplines, right? That they are actually a way of cutting off the interface of knowledge. And that one of the things that CRT had committed to was actually this interdisciplinarity that was being practiced by, and that I was basically liberated by, because it meant that I didn't have to cabin some part of myself off from the work that I was doing. I mean, one of the things was that I wanted to have a place where I was writing as me, right, without having to separate off those things. So, yeah, I had some good models. We really can just go, we
All right. Since about the beginning of the planning of this symposium, I have been bothering Cheryl to get me the full text of the poem for Alma. And I think about the day before it goes to the printer, she finally gets it to me. And it's a testament to how prolific and how talented a writer you are that there's this beautiful piece that you have no idea where it is. And I remember when you finally gave it to me and I read it, it made me tear up. And then my second thought was, God damn it, Cheryl, do you have to be good at everything? And the image that you see on, I think, the third page of your program, we wanted to get this as a gift for you on behalf of the CRS faculty and students,
so beautiful.
To show how much you mean to us. Thank you. Also, I just told Devin that I want one for my house too.
Thank you.
Sorry. And with that, we will take a break let's take a break till 3. So please come back at 3, and afterwards our reception will be outside in the courtyard. The reception will start around 5:30, so please join us. There will be delicious food, drinks, and there are going to be some surprises. So please join us. Girl, can we get a picture?